Listen-only mode.
Go. Good. All right. Good morning, everyone, to Charity and Security Network webinar on building peace in permanent war. This webinar tool is fairly easy to use once you get used to it, but in the beginning, we'd like to go over a few of the technical details just so that everything will go smoothly. For this webinar service, the microphone is automatically muted for attendees and only presenters will be heard. However, the session is being recorded and will be posted online later. You are able to ask a question by expanding the question box in the dashboard and then type in your question, and during the Q&A session, we'll be reading the questions to the presenters and giving them all a chance to answer. If you need to contact us or would like to send a private message to another attendee, that is what the chat option allows you to do. You can select the audience for your message. If you say entire audience, please be sure that's your intention. If you're having technical difficulties and need to just contact us, there's an option for that as well. If you are having trouble with the audio on the program, don't leave the webinar. But you can use the call-in portion as well so that you can hear over the phone. There is a two-phone option on the dashboard that allows you to view the video while listening through the phone. Use the dial-in number for your country that is provided. Long-distance charges may apply. That's our warning. Be sure to have the access code included as well. Otherwise, you won't be able to enter the webinar by phone. And now I want to introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Louise Boon-Kuo is a lecturer in law at Sydney University, Australia. Her research focuses on policing, criminal law, and borders, and her forthcoming book, Mobility, Citizenship, and Illegality, will be published in 2016. Dr. Vicki Sentas is a lecturer in law at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Her research is broadly concerned with the impacts of counterterrorism on practices of criminalization. She is the author of the book Traces of Terror, Counterterrorism, Law, Policing, and Race, published in 2014. They, along with Gavin Sullivan and Ben Hayes, are co-authors of this report featured today. And we appreciate them presenting from Australia, where it is 11:30 at night. Lisa Schirch is Director of Human Security at the Alliance for Peacebuilding and a research professor at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. She is a former Fulbright Fellow in East and West Africa and has conducted conflict assessments in peacebuilding in over 20 countries. Tomicah Tillemann is a Senior Fellow and Director of Bretton Woods II at the New America Foundation. He is formerly Senior Advisor for Civil Society and Emerging Democracies at the Department of State under Secretary Clinton and Kerry. At the State Department, he established and chaired the department's Global Philanthropy Working Group. In his current position, he leads a consortium of many of the world's largest holders of asset holders to dedicate 1% of their resources to social impact and development. Now, just a quick word for some context, particularly important to those of us based in the U.S. 5 years ago, the Supreme Court decision in Holder versus Humanitarian Project held that it is constitutional for the Congress to prohibit basic peacebuilding activities as defined as technical advice, service, and assistance is part of the Prohibition on Material Support of Terrorism, a criminal law statute. The divided court ruled that Congress does not have to have this prohibition, but that it is within its discretion because of national security. On 2 occasions, the peacebuilding community, with broad support from the rest of U.S. civil society, submitted requests to the Secretary of State to use existing legal powers to exempt peacebuilding activities from this prohibition, once to Secretary Clinton and once to Secretary Kerry. Neither effort was successful, but shortly after the request was submitted to Secretary Kerry, We instead went for a permanent legislative fix when the Humanitarian Assistance Facilitation Act was filed in the last Congress. Currently, we are working on a similar bill to be filed in the current Congress that would allow communications to prevent or alleviate the suffering of the civilian population, including speech or communications to reduce or eliminate the frequency and severity of violent conflict and reducing its impact on civilian populations. Now, welcome. Thank you to all our presenters, and I'll hand it over to Louise and Vicki.
Hang on just a second. Vicki, I need to unmute you. Okay.
Thank you, Kagan and Andrea Hall from the Charity and Security Network for inviting us to present on our report, Peacebuilding in Permanent War, Terrorist Listing and Conflict Transformation. As you mentioned, the report is co-authored, and the just showing. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get the screen up. Can you see the slide at the moment? The report is co-authored, and the project itself was auspiced by the International State Crime Initiative from Queen Mary University of London and the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands. The project was generously supported by the Berghoff Foundation and the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. It's particularly pertinent to be presenting our research in the month of the 5th anniversary of the Holder and Humanitarian Law Project decision, as Peacebuilders' concerns about the Supreme Court's decision were an important impetus for our research. Whilst research had explored the impact of listing on humanitarian aid, little is known about the effects on peacebuilding, which has important differences in objectives and practices. The aim of our research was to investigate the impacts of terrorist listing on peacebuilders and peacebuilding. Peacebuilding is, of course, heterogeneous with often contradictory practices, so we adopted a broad definition of peacebuilding and undertook interviews between 2012 and 2014 with government officials, NGOs and civil society organisations engaged in peace, development and human rights work, diaspora groups and professional mediators. The report explores 3 case studies. In each, one party of the conflict is listed as terrorist, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Hamas and others in Palestine, and the PKK in Turkey. The background of our research team is in counter-terrorism. We're not peacebuilding practitioners, and as the project developed, our counter-terrorism lens became increasingly important to help us make sense of what we're finding in the peacebuilding domain. We examined a broad range of listing regimes, including UN and EU sanctions, as well as the national lists of key states such as the US and the UK. Terrorist lists are usually justified by states and international organisations as necessary tools for preventing political violence or incentivising moves towards demilitarisation. Terrorist lists designate individuals or groups as terrorists, subjecting them to asset freezing and travel ban sanctions, isolating those listed materially by cutting off financial and other support, and by delegitimising their claims. But despite the discourse of targeted sanctions, terrorist lists cast a deliberately wide net. The rationale behind counterterrorism laws is that terrorists are nodes within a broader social and political network of support, and that it is necessary to disrupt all support. Terrorist listing and the offences triggered by listing thus target those who may directly or indirectly associate with those listed. A persistent critique of legal scholars is that counterterrorism laws impose liability for a broad range of conduct, including acts that are not violent nor intended to support political violence. By targeting specified associations, such as direct or indirect provision of training or material support, counterterrorism laws seek to preempt anticipated acts, adopting the logic of the preemptive military strike to permit punishment for acts that may never occur. And listing operates thus as a weapon of war, often deployed as one part of a much broader counterinsurgency strategy alongside measures like military intervention, targeted killing, and other forms of high-value targeting. However, preemptive security regimes do not rely on prosecution or administrative sanctions for their effect. Counter-terrorism lists rather realise their coercive potential through disrupting associations and forcing actors to change their behaviour to avoid liabilities. And this was very much evident in our findings. Today we want to highlight two of the key disruptive impacts on peacebuilding discussed in our report. First, listing has resulted in peacebuilders' withdrawal from work and the outsourcing risk. Our research shows that terrorist listing has profoundly disruptive effects on diverse forms of conflict work, whether working at close proximity to armed groups deemed terrorist or at a distance as part of the broader conflict transformation community. This echoes the findings of similar studies of counter-terrorism's impact on the humanitarian and development sectors. In all three of our case studies, we identified multiple forms of risk aversion practice taking root as a direct response to terrorist listing measures, including the wholesale withdrawal of international actors, donors and NGOs from effective conflict areas or projects. Many of those the research team spoke with told us these laws were making their peacebuilding efforts increasingly ineffective and were exacerbating rather than helping to resolve complex conflicts. For example, one NGO explained how they had recently obtained international funds to undertake small-scale conflict resolution and local governance projects in 21 communities across south-central Somalia, deemed recently liberated from al-Shabaab. Upon closer dialogue, they found that 14 of these areas were still under the de facto control of al-Shabaab or affiliated clans, and that the organisation would likely need to pay taxes to work there. In the end, they were only able to work in 3 of the 21 planned areas, all of which were under the control of the pro-transitional federal government forces. In fact, as one organisation explained, the only kind of peace projects they could legitimately carry out in south-central Somalia were ones that were state-building. This was undermining their capacity to engage affected communities, creating distrust and resentment. Working only in government-controlled areas and communities contradicts conflict transformation values that emphasise that engagement with all parties to the conflict is necessary for change. In another example, a peace project was being delivered, but accounting irregularities were found because the project avoided acknowledging that taxes were paid to al-Shabaab for access to particular areas. The donor government shut down all funding of peace and development work in al-Shabaab-controlled areas after that time. And at the time of the report, this policy remained in place. There's a tangible sense of frustration by those working within conflict areas that the legal prohibitions, to quote, prevent us from being creative. The problem is that ideas cannot be destroyed by a gun. Ideas must be destroyed by counter-ideas. Apart from averting risk through withdrawal, government and international NGOs also report the outsourcing of risk to smaller local civil society partners as a way of keeping their peace programs running in uncertain legal conditions. Peace organisations working in the occupied Palestinian territories told us that the European Union's diplomatic no-contact policy with Hamas was having a dramatic impact on their work. It has meant that the EU works through NGOs rather than engaging the Gaza authorities directly to fulfil the EU's Partnership for Peace programme, effectively outsourcing some of the risks and difficulties of operating in the occupied Palestinian territories from governments to NGOs. Outsourcing has many flow-on effects. In the OPT and elsewhere, NGOs are more vulnerable to being policed by the Israeli government, stopped at the border, subject to criminal and civil litigation. Smaller local organisations face more risks. And because of this, NGOs report being cautious about engaging members of proscribed organisations, undermining the objective of reaching those communities regarded as blocking conflict transformation, and also contributing to the failure to address the root causes of conflict. By way of contrast, government and professional mediators were, on the whole, less concerned about personal liability. They explained they feel protected by their proximity to government and by their peace-building mandate. Nevertheless, counter-terrorism listing fundamentally disrupts the potential for successful mediation. This can be seen most acutely through the marginalisation of civil society's potential for involvement in conflict transformation. And I'll hand over to Vicki to speak about that.
that is, it plays out counterinsurgency thinking that it's the broader civil and political movements that support armed actors that must be targeted, not simply those individuals engaged in violence, be it military or terroristic violence directed towards civilians. And this is where listing clashes with the principles of conflict transformation that civil society must be included as a necessary part of any sustainable peace process. So to continue with the examples in our case study about the occupied Palestinian territories, the effects of outsourcing and the risk of listing from large to small organisations is that Palestinian civil society bears the brunt. And in particular, it's been well documented that Muslim NGOs and charities have borne this disruption, with a very large number of particularly Muslim NGOs in the West having been investigated or prosecuted and shut down. So even when an organisation has been formally cleared, the consequences may continue, as an organisation might be refused financial services due to risk-averse banks, or denied permission to enter or operate in Gaza by Israel. No longer able to operate in the occupied Palestinian territories, the direct result of this disruption is that there are now a range of charities with no connection to Palestinian society who have filled this space. Local peace builders report this as a problem for Palestinian society to organise autonomously and for and with diverse needs and political claims. And if we're to turn to Turkey, our third case study, here we documented how political opportunities for the Kurds to explore legitimate self-determination claims had been effectively criminalised by Turkey's domestic counter-terrorism legislation, and in practice legitimated in a number of diverse ways by, for example, the EU's regional regime, US and other national listing regimes listing the PKK. So in particular in the period of 2009 to 2013, which happened to coincide with the same time as the democratic opening called by Turkey's AKP government, and we saw the introduction of at times quite promising piecemeal reforms to democratise the country being introduced. At that very same time, we saw 40,000 people being prosecuted for non-violent terrorism offences, including associating with, aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation. This is quite profound and arguably one of the largest counter-terrorism operations in the world. So these so-called operations against the KCK, the Kurdistan Communities Council, were targeted to the widest array of civil society, including human rights lawyers, trade unionists, mayors, politicians, journalists and activists. So these repressions came precisely at a time when the PKK and Kurdish civil society, which includes the KCK, had been experimenting with forms of self-organisation and direct democracy, what the PKK has termed its democratic autonomy project. Roughly this translates as a network of people's assemblies at the village and municipal and city levels. So democratic autonomy has been part of the PKK's ongoing roadmap for peace and democratisation within Turkey, having long given up demands for a separate state. And so these are precisely the kinds of social relations that create a democratic political alternative to the military conflict. And these are also, not by any coincidence, the same social relations that are, we argue, intentionally targeted by global listing regimes. So for Turkey, the KCK are simply the urban wing of the PKK and represent the creation of a parallel state. We found in our research that the democratic autonomy movement was also at times poorly recognised by some international NGOs in these very same terms and seen as a provocation to the fragile peace process. Now this is in spite of now established international commentary that the PKK and their sister movements in Syria represent, I guess, one of the best opportunities for democratic stability in the Middle East. And then there's the well-commented breathtaking hypocrisy of many Western states in maintaining the listing of the PKK while heavily relying on the PKK in its fight against ISIS. So I guess the point from this example is that counterterrorism laws have been quite successful in imposing a distance between kind of formal peace builders in civil society that are connected and criminalised through the connections to listed actors. And that distance may well be crucial in the targeting and prosecution of civil society. And so we see this form of disenfranchisement of civil society through listing in very stark contrast to one of the more fundamental norms of what we refer to in the report as the transformative peace-building principles. And that is that civil society engagement involvement is essential for sustainable resolution of political conflicts. So in the report we try to make sense of these forms of disruption as an effect of how listing might deepen a convergence between peace and security. So the common view amongst those that we spoke with, and it's also evident in the literature, is that terrorist listing is shrinking the space for which peace building can occur. But our research findings suggest that the space available for peace building is not merely retracting in relation to these measures, and that the disruptive effects of terrorist listing might be better understood as qualitatively transforming peace building. So that is, peace building is being repurposed and securitised in novel ways. So building on Mark Duffield's work, we use the term security peacebuilding nexus to try and capture this emergent process. So this entanglement and interconnection between peacebuilding and security, which is furthered through listing, is grounded in two assumptions. So the first, that conflict-prone and underdeveloped states are a primary breeding ground for insecurity and global security threats, and second, that it's only through liberal forms of peace and state building initiatives that peace and stability can ultimately be realised. So through listing, these assumptions appear to be working together to further redefine the rationale for peace building through security logics of risk, threat and danger. So this convergence can be readily observed in donor states, so where only, for example, peace projects that align with core security objectives, ones that eschew contact with those affiliated with listed groups, may be institutionally supported and funded. One of the key points of our report, however, is that the disruptive effect of counter-terrorism listing relies in part on peace builders' actions. It operates through withdrawal, through risk aversion and so on, as we document in our report. So our research shows how increased liability threats are leading peace builders to self-regulate their behaviour, and in so doing create newly securitised ways of undertaking their work. So I think one of the legacy of the Holder decision is that it shapes and transforms peace-building practices well beyond individual acts of prosecution, the reality being that in the formal kind of peace-building sector, prosecutions, are quite deliberately targeted, and that it's not well-established international NGOs who appear to be the target. And that this kind of processal approach that we take is something that is securitization is something that's exercised at least in part through peace-building practice. So we want to end with some brief thoughts on how we might counteract the impacts of listing and the challenges and the opportunities that this presents. As lawyers and not peace builders, we'd be very interested in the audience's responses to this. I think one of the political challenges that lies ahead for the peace-building community is to unpack how this process is taking shape and to debate much more openly about how we can counter our own forms of securitisation, because if it continues to be immunised from challenge by those at the centre of peace building, then the securitisation of peace building undoubtedly stands to become more embedded. I guess most states and some conflict practitioners we've spoken to remain convinced that listing can have a positive coercive effect in forcing armed groups to the negotiating table. Whilst there have been historical instances where delisting has been crucial for the commencement of peace talks, it seems that the record demonstrates that listing itself creates more barriers than incentives. We think that the evidence is clear that listing is not an emancipatory peacebuilding tool. It deeply undermines peacebuilding by contributing to state repression of political claims, human rights abuses, and militarised approaches to conflict. But what can be done? Of course, the political environment for challenging this order is tightly constrained, and peacebuilders navigate a complex terrain. But can peacebuilding organisations do more to build solidarity with impacted peoples to support their claims and their advocacy, say through peace meets justice approaches? And we outline some of those approaches and traditions in our report. There is, of course, much resistance to listing already, both within and outside the formal peacebuilding sector. Largely outside the formal sector, there are popular campaigns and legal efforts towards delisting organisations. And within the peacebuilding sector, there has been important work calling for exemptions for peacebuilding activities designed to reduce violent conflict and its impact, such as the work being done by the Charity and Security Network, which Kay introduced. Peacebuilders have also discussed other approaches, including exemptions for specific organisations, reforming prosecutorial guidelines in order to take account of peacebuilding intentions in a number of different jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom. But to what extent do these claims challenge the premise of listing? The fact that all armed conflicts, no matter what their cause or objective, are transformed into terrorism is maintained as an object of listing. It's a basic point, but it's one that only grows more intensely relevant. Armed conflicts have political causes, and listing not only does nothing to address the causes of political violence, but it can regenerate new political grievances. So we make the argument in our report that recognition of armed conflicts, being an important first step to recognising the trauma of populations subject to both non-state actor violence as well as state violence, ends up being obscured through the listing process. So we hope that our findings provide some additional fresh grounds to reinvigorate calls to, and this might sound provocative, to abolish the entire prescription regime, and in addition to the important reform work that is being done. So abolitionist arguments are largely made by some lawyers and affected peoples, and we hope that our report can be a resource to support debates about listing, and also that the gaps in our research can lead to much needed empirical work on counter-terrorism approaches to conflict. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vicki and Louise. That is a very important report, and I hope it does generate the kind of discussion about the utility of the listing regime and the benefits of peace building that are being unrealized that needs to go forward. Now I'd like to hand it over to Lisa Schirch of the Alliance for Peace Building and Eastern Mennonite University, who will give us some commentary. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. I'm just checking to see whether you can see my screen.
Not yet. There we go. We have it.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Charity and Security Network, for hosting this webinar and all the important conversations that you're hosting on these issues. And thank you, Vicki and Louise, for this really spectacular report. I've been working on these issues for a long time, but this report had so many new ideas and concepts in terms of the questions that you were asking about the international legal frameworks backing up the listing, as well as the relevance of international humanitarian law to peace builders and the kinds of challenges that we are facing in terms of attempting to be independent and impartial in the midst of trying to do our work. I want to start, I have 10 slides, 10 minutes, so I'm going to be quick on each slide. Just the key takeaways for me were these quotes, first two quotes. The space for peace building is not merely shrinking, it is being thoroughly repurposed, qualitatively transformed, and securitized in the in trying to figure out how does peacebuilding relate to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, I have definitely stumbled and longed for this kind of analysis you've provided to us. You know, I think that we in the peacebuilding field need to face our own securitization, all the tempting ways that we have tried to figure out how to articulate where there is common ground and where there is difference between counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and peacebuilding. What I think the big idea for me in this report is that we need many more opportunities with legal scholars such as yourselves, with humanitarians, with the security and peacebuilding actors that are operating with us out there in the same space to discuss these issues. Okay, how do I get my, there we go. So, you know, I think at the beginning of the war on terror, many of us tried to think, okay, maybe these things, counterterrorism and peacebuilding, are complementary. And I think increasingly over the last 14 years since 9/11, we've been seeing that civil society increasingly is articulating that counterterrorism and peacebuilding are contradictory. They are not complementary. So it's not just that we have different approaches operating in the same space. It's that the counterterrorism approach is directly undermining and contradicting the work of civil society in peacebuilding. The second thing I was really happy to see in your report is a distinction between liberal peacebuilding, which I would be, you know, describe as you did as a focus on state building and top-down, so official mediation, with the notions of conflict transformation, which I often refer to as local conflict prevention and peacebuilding, which has its origins in 30 to 40 years of civil society practice around the world, of mediating, of doing track 2 diplomacy, which has been seen as complementary to state-based official mediation. And I think that provided the groundwork for us wanting to see counterterrorism as somehow complementary and not completely contradictory to what we were doing. But, you know, I think for many scholars of peacebuilding around the world, they don't yet have these two ideas, that the word peacebuilding is now identified, defined in very different ways by different groups of people. So the liberal peacebuilding agenda is often associated with regime change, elections, Western interests, where conflict transformation, local peacebuilding is locally defined human security and local actors in the lead, the local ownership argument. What's been interesting to me over the last couple of years is recognizing that counterterrorism and conflict transformation have a different analysis and different theories of change. So I just want to add that language onto your report. You know, counterterrorism, as you know, focuses on methods and tactics. The perpetrators, which is how stakeholders are named, are seen as motivated by a vague evil. And so this analysis then shapes the theory of change, or what is done to intervene to address the situation. And so if perpetrators are seen as motivated by a vague evil, there's no need to address root causes, there's no need for negotiation. All of that is seen as ridiculous within that analytical framework. In conflict transformation, we focus, as you say, on root causes, which are often state structures and policies. We refer to stakeholders as motivated by grievances that are often about political and economic exclusion and repression. But we also use stakeholders to refer to state actors, noting that states are using terrorist methods just as much as non-state armed groups. And so the focus on methods, we would agree to define that and then needing to apply it equally to state and non-state armed groups. The analytical irony that really stuck out to me in this report is that you note that counterterrorism policies differ in how far back the criminal law should reach into the chain of causation for terrorism. And so if a peacebuilding organization is providing negotiation training to Hamas, then we are seen as part of the chain of causation of Hamas's or any group's acts. What is interesting and ironic, the irony here is that the behavior and policies of the states themselves is frequently cited as the motivations for the tactic of terrorism. The nature of the state is correlating with the presence of terrorism, and there's been many reports that show that. You know, recently there's been a lot of focus on kleptocracy and corruption. You know, states that are elite captured, where the state is based on corruption, designed to create profit for an elite group. It is not citizen-oriented. These kinds of states have more groups, non-state armed groups, that are using terrorist methods. Likewise, the Global Terrorism Index has cited repeatedly that there is a correlation between states that do not observe human rights, particularly those that use military or police force to repress political dissent, and the existence of non-state armed groups that use or are deemed as on terrorist lists. So there is this cycle between state repression and terrorist or insurgent groups. That should be in quotes because, you know, as the report points out, many of these groups have legitimate grievances, have self-determination claims, and their grievances, the root causes they are citing for their violence traces back directly to the state. So that last slide, you know, the irony here is that the counterterrorism policies are trying to chase it back, and if you chase this back farther enough, it comes to the state itself as causing and fueling terrorism. The next slide here is just trying to compare the theories of change between counterterrorism and conflict transformation. Counterterrorism focuses on isolation and punishment, thinking that this intervention will prevent and stop violent extremism and the use of terrorism. Conflict transformation is the exact opposite, not isolation, but engagement and addressing root causes such as the political and economic structural change that will prevent and stop violent extremism. The second line there is how differently they view civil society. So counterterrorism uses and advocates for repression and pacification of civil society. That can be everything from violent repression to hearts and minds types of pacification that just tries to buy or rent the allegiance of local groups so they won't support a non-state armed group. So that repression and pacification ensures the isolation of groups using violence in the counterterrorism approach. The empowerment of civil society and the protection of civilians in civil society space is the theory of change on the conflict transformation side. This slide really just looks at, you know, how do we take a report like this, which provides us with new language and new evidence of the impact of counterterrorism, and look and have a broader conversation about evidence-based approaches and evidence-based policies. The RAND Corporation published research called How Do Terrorist Groups End? And they used the statistics in this graphic. The report documents that counterterrorism listing discourages belief in political solutions. That's one of the unintended impacts of counterterrorism listing. So this graphic appears to reinforce the need for political processes such as conflict transformation that address the root causes. The graphic also appears to call into question mainstream counterterrorism approaches because military force is not a frequent way that terrorist groups are ending. And, you know, this graphic from the Global Terrorism Index in 2014 noted that terrorism causes 5 times more deaths today than in 2001, despite 14 years of counterterrorism policies. So what would be the theory of change that these policies are producing the exact opposite effect that they are intending? Why isn't there a bigger public conversation on that, and why isn't the peacebuilding community out in front in pushing for monitoring and evaluation of all of our efforts? Peacebuilding, we have been serious about monitoring and evaluation, and counterterrorism also needs to be serious about monitoring and evaluating their theories of change, their analysis of what the problem's about. The last slide here, I think this, you know, trying to move us toward evidence-based policy there's two quotes from the report that I want to end with. One is that behavioral change to abandon violence emerged from armed actors' political decisions and their own discussions and the engagement they had with other groups, not the use of state coercion through terrorist listing or repression. So there is evidence to suggest the ways that terrorist groups are changing their tactics and are changing their political and methods. The second quote, "Their unpredictable and adverse consequences of counterterrorism may generate legal and political problems that make conflicts more intractable and more difficult to resolve." And I think ISIS is a prime example of this, because the groups, you know, Al-Qaeda dissociated from ISIS because ISIS has become so extreme, you know, are pushing away an isolation of Al-Qaeda when they were writing letters to America and trying to engage in the political and economic analysis that was driving their violence. You know, the rejection of any political discussion of that has made it even more difficult and has led to the emergence of even more radicalized groups. So that is the end. Thank you very much.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, you're
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. This is Kay. Now we'll move to Tomicah Tillemann for more commentary, followed by question and answer. Tomicah, you can activate your webcam.
Thank you. I am trying to do that. We will hopefully have it up here in a moment.
There we go.
There we are. Greetings. Well, it's great to be with you, and thanks very much to Kay and Andrea and everyone else for pulling this together. It's really an excellent discussion. And frankly, I don't know that it's possible to add much to the superb commentary that we've heard already from the other panelists. This has been very comprehensive and, at least for me, extremely educational. I would make a couple of points, and then I'm eager to get into the Q&A, because I think that's where we will likely derive the greatest benefits. First, my first job in Washington was working for a guy who many of you may have heard of named Joe Biden, and he loved to meet with civil society. He would begin most of these meetings by donning a very wry smile and invoking a line from Ronald Reagan. And he would say, you know, I'm from the 9 most dangerous words in the English language, or I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And I think there, you know, is certainly a little truth to that. It would always draw a laugh, and one of the reasons that it would is that it touched on something that is an all too painful reality, which is even when governments have the best of intentions, they have real challenges converting aspirations into effective action. And that's certainly the case in this space. I think, frankly, it's inevitable that that's going to be the case in this space. This is a very, very complex set of issues, and we have enough challenges trying to do conflict resolution and engagement with civil society domestically in an environment where we understand the dynamics and we have a pretty good feeling for the actors. That challenge is exponentially more difficult when we take it into a context where we're working abroad, and that's what we find, of course, in the field of peace building. So I think you need to come to this with an assumption that this is going to be a very challenging undertaking for governments, and there is, of course, no instruction manual for how they should carry out this work and how they should impose or implement regulations in this space. They're figuring this out as they go along. I think it's fair to say that most foreign ministries have hundreds of years of experience when it comes to establishing rules of the road for engagement with other states and other countries, but they have very, very limited experience when it comes to figuring out the rules for working with these non-state actors. And this is a process of evolution that is going to take some time. And with that as a backdrop, I think I would add 3 points to the excellent items that have been placed on the table already. The first is that government is a plural noun, and we often think of the position of the U.S. government or the position of any government as being a monolithic opinion. On the inside, that's absolutely not the way things work, and you will find a tremendous diversity of opinion, and you'll find a tremendous diversity of equities. Just as most of the challenges that you all are trying to address are too big for any one country to solve on their own, similarly, these challenges are too big for any one ministry or any one agency to solve on their own. So you will find radically different approaches on these issues at USAID, at the State Department, at the Department of Treasury, at the Department of Defense, within the intelligence community, and it's critical to recognize where the different equities lie as you work to craft solutions. In many instances, you'll have agencies that have a very narrow mandate, and their job is to carry out that mandate no matter what. So for example, the organizations and the entities that work on counter-terrorist financing, they have a very clear job, and that job is to prevent the transfer of resources to violent extremists. Now, they don't care much about other equities, and so it's critical to find other actors within the bureaucracy who are closely aligned, or at least more closely aligned, with the views that you may have and the challenges that you may be seeking to address. And I would add to that that it's very important in the midst of this to recognize that even those actors who are causing trouble may in fact have good intentions. They just have a very different way of pursuing those issues. And I'll come back to that a little bit at the moment, at the end in a moment. The second point I wanted to make is that the balance in most societies between chaos and order is determined by how many citizens feel they can work within the system and how many citizens feel that they need to work outside the system. And this is an area where, again, I think you all have the potential to find some real allies and some real partners as you carry out this work. In many instances, the task of peace building, the task of conflict resolution, can serve to keep people operating within whatever structure exists. And in most instances, governments are going to have a vested interest in preserving the status quo. Again, there are, of course, many cases in which this analogy breaks down due to circumstances on the ground. But on the whole, governments recognize that if you can keep people operating within the peaceful context of civil society, if you can encourage individuals and organizations to engage constructively with their counterparts on the other side of a conflict, rather than through violence, then that works to everyone's advantage. And again, I think many of your organizations and much of the work that you all are engaged in is ideally suited to address those challenges. The last point that I would make is you need to be able to speak using the arguments of the other side. And this may sound a little bit convoluted, in some instances, I think people may bristle at that suggestion. But having been in these meetings in the Situation Room in the White House and elsewhere, in most cases, the bureaucratic advocates who are working on behalf of civil society are dramatically outgunned by those who are working against the interests of security, or those who are addressing economic challenges or economic considerations around financing. So you need to recognize that if you go into these conversations hoping to simply make the argument based on principle, in almost every case you're going to end up in a bureaucratic war of attrition, and you will lose that battle. So it's essential to start looking at the arguments and the concerns that are raised by the other side and trying to tap into opportunities for common ground, tap into opportunities for empathy with those who are working on other issues. Again, you all are very good at this. This is what you do, so you don't need to hear it from me. But I think it's important to state that at the outset. We oftentimes view government, and those in government, I think, oftentimes view civil society as having a single and monolithic vision of how these issues should be addressed, and that's just not the case. And so to the extent you are able to identify common ground, to the extent you are able to highlight the potential for work with security advocates and for work with those who are trying to address other components of this challenge, you're likely going to do a lot better than if you simply stick to a narrow set of principles that, while very right and very righteous, probably aren't going to carry the day in the context of the debates and discussions that are going to occur behind closed doors. So with that, let me wrap up by saying I think there's a tremendous opportunity for all of you to make Joe Biden's joke a little bit less funny and to, by virtue of your engagement on this issue, try to work toward a day in which government won't be the biggest challenge. It won't be the most dangerous in trying to address these issues. I think in many cases government will be the biggest problem, but it's also the only solution when it comes to getting this right. But we don't get there without your help. We don't get there without the urging and the pushing of actors in civil society. So I hope you all will be very successful in that work. And I think the reports that we've heard today are a very important advance in achieving that goal. Thank you.
You're on now.
Thank you, Tomicah. Now ask all the presenters to activate your webcams so that we can go into the question and answer period, and we'll make sure that you're all unmuted. We have 2 questions so far. I encourage people to use the question box to submit more. I have a few myself, but we'll start with a question that's come in about legal practitioners and what is being done to protect legal practitioners who are providing technical advice or training to groups that are engaging in or want to engage in peace processes but are on the list. Is there anything you know of that is distinguishing legal practitioners from other peace building practitioners, and what globally what efforts are out there? And you should all presenters be unmuted, so please feel free to jump in.
I missed the first part of your question. It wasn't, you did.
Sorry, the question had, what is being done, if anything, to address the situation of legal practitioners who are advising groups on the Forest Terrorist Organization list in terms of engaging in conflict resolution processes? And that distinguished from general peace building activities. Is there anything separate being done for legal practitioners in this field?
I don't know.
No.
If I understand the question correctly, do you mean the ways in which lawyers who might advise listed groups themselves become criminalised? Is that the intention? Okay. So I guess it depends on different jurisdictions. Say, for example, in the conflict between Turkey and the PKK, we've seen a huge number of lawyers who are charged with basically being the lawyers for the PKK, being charged with terrorism offences. Certainly there's a long tradition around the repression of different kind of social movements, of human rights defenders, in particular lawyers being caught up and criminalised in a number of ways. And certainly there's, I mean, I'm most familiar with the Turkish jurisdiction. Since the kind of the listing of the PKK, an escalation and the legitimation of quite serious human rights abuses against lawyers on the basis that they're fronts for terrorist organisations.
Okay. Anyone? I'd like to move to another question, and give me while I read the small text down here. And it's thanking you for the presentation and the report, very timely and thorough work. I have a question about how we can accommodate political ambitions beyond those directly related to grievances with the conflict transformation analytical framework. For example, root cause analysis of grievances in Iraq and Syria that can explain the attraction of ISIL, but the leadership's political ambitions seem to be arguably beyond those directly related to those grievances. How can we take into account the more overtly political ambitions of leadership while working at the community level and at the transformative level?
It's a great question. I don't have any answers for that question, though.
I guess the question is, in a peace building process where the armed organizations' political ambitions may differ greatly from the ambitions of the communities and the territories where they control, that being a very big issue with ISIL. In terms of the potential for a peace building approach, how do you deal with that dynamic? And I guess in that going to distinguishing communities and areas controlled by the group from the leadership of the group itself.
So that was the work I was doing in Afghanistan, was very similar to that, because the Taliban was a nebulous large group, but actually it was a lot of local non-state armed groups, very loosely affiliated often, or in conflict with each other, and they had diverse motives. So some of the non-state armed groups in Afghanistan had very local grievances about one provincial governor who was corrupt. And so that's the kind of SSR, security sector reform, and demobilization, disarmament, reintegration work was trying to do analysis up front to figure out, is there a way of doing local peace processes that would engage with the diverse motivations and grievances within a non-state armed group. And so I think it would be similar for Daesh or ISIL, ISIS, that there's many different motivations for these different groups. Unfortunately, the counterterrorism listing laws put them all together in one big bunch. So, you know, the work that I was doing was probably illegal in Afghanistan, and it was definitely outsourcing the risk, because it was NGOs in Afghanistan that were doing this engagement with the groups, trying to figure out what were their motivations, what were their grievances, could they be separated from the big umbrella label that they had been put under. So, I mean, yes, the peace-building process approach would try to look at the diverse grievances, but again, it's very difficult to do that given these legal obstacles to engaging.
I have 2 more questions. Dr. Sentas and Dr. Boon-Kuo, you both have used the terms humanitarian assistance and peace building and remarked upon how terror listing has disrupted both. Do you see these terrorist listing related issues affecting both activities in largely similar ways, or what are key differences?
Yeah, so I mean, just to start, and I think Louise has more to contribute. The particular focus of our report, given there'd been, you know, a wealth of you know, quite great work done on the specific impacts on humanitarian actors, and you know, we're certainly not experts in the peace building field, not being peace building practitioners, but it appeared that it had been far less work on the specific impacts on peace builders. And, you know, they are, you know, very closely related, but quite different traditions, you know, doing, you know, quite often different kind of work. And certainly there are sort of specific kind of impacts. And I think the emphasis of the report in terms of what distinguishes one of those impacts around peace building, I guess, is the broader impact on civil society actors who are closely related to armed groups, either because of their political affiliations. I'm not talking about direct necessarily financial kind of support, but the idea in a peace building kind of methodology around understanding kind of root causes and grievances really taps into the ways in which, you know, we argue one of the intended kind of structural effects of counterterrorism listing is to disrupt those social relations that civil society organisations have to armed actors. And I think that's one of the key differences, but Louise will have more to add.
Yeah, just to add one point to that, is that difference, the difference in the practices of humanitarian assistance and peace building make a huge difference in
Okay, I think we lost
Louise,
the audio on
we
Louise.
lost you.
Okay, sorry, we've lost the audio on Louise. But now
Lisa would like to ask.
Lisa would like to ask Tomicah a question. So let's move to that.
The liability of individual organisations. For peace builders,
Audio's back on.
for peace builders, the concern, given that the interest of peace builders is in conflict, if we're talking about seeking conflict transformation, then simply addressing counter-terrorism listing reform as a matter of addressing the individual liability of peace-building organisations is simply not going to be sufficient because of those broader impacts on civil society participation in peace processes.
Okay, now Lisa wants to ask a question for Tomicah, so please go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much, Tomicah, for your very good advice and your advocacy for civil society when you were at the State Department. I think you're absolutely right that the internal divisions within states and governments is quite, well, there's a big gap between the different approaches and theories of change within government. So you're right that we should be more discriminating when we talk. But my question is this. You know, at the end of my slides, I talked about, can we have a conversation on evidence-based approaches or evidence-based policies? Would you recommend going down the road of trying to look at data on what approaches to non-state armed groups are working, you know, kind of going to RAND and trying to expand that work and update it with a peace-building approach? I mean, would that be one strategy we could use?
Absolutely. I think that's your single best shot. And, you know, it has, as Henry Kissinger would say, when you're reviewing, you know, these different approaches and the evidence that you outlined, it has the added advantage of being true. And I think that's important and something that is often lost in this space. Frankly, I think if you look at the last 14 years, we've pursued a lot of different approaches, as you indicated, without much success in most instances. And to the extent we don't want this to be a permanent conflict, we need to get smarter a lot faster than we are getting smarter when it comes to the tactics and strategies that we're utilizing. So I think that's exactly the right approach. I think it's the only approach at the end of the day that is going to provide enough ammunition for advocates of civil society within these interagency struggles to make a real impact and get where you need to go. But it requires very good evidence because I can guarantee you whatever you put on the table is going to be picked apart. So it's, I think, a very good approach. I think, again, the evidence you cited and the RAND work is a big step in the right direction. But we really need to accelerate those efforts because right now so much of what's happening is being done in a vacuum, and individuals think they're doing the right thing. You have ministries and bureaucracies and agencies that believe they are solving the problem when in fact often playing into the hands of those who would seek to exacerbate the conflict to begin with. And until we can break that cycle, I think we're going to be in a challenging position.
That leaves me, I'm going to combine a few of the questions that were submitted in a question of going back to the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project case and the U.S. material support prohibition, which applies to U.S. persons but also has extraterritorial jurisdiction so that someone engaged in peace building anywhere in the world when they come to the U.S. could conceivably be prosecuted for engagement with an FTO outside the U.S. And the report described the U.S. restriction as the world's strictest. I'd like to ask, are there models out there of other approaches that are working?
Sorry, Kay, we lost you.
Okay. My question, repeat again, are there models of other laws out there that are not as strict and absolute as the U.S. prohibition that we can point to as evidence of workable frameworks for peace-building engagement with listed groups? Could you hear it?
We could only catch snatches, but if I understand the question is that, yes, the American regime is kind of the most extensive in terms of its extraterritoriality. There's huge diversity in the ways in which listing laws are constructed. You know, there are those kind of laws in some of the European jurisdictions that have a much better relationship between the conduct that's being criminalised and the standards around criminal responsibility. So, for example, you might need to be successfully prosecuted for supporting a terrorist organisation. You might need to show a clear intention that you intended that your support further an act of political violence. I mean, the breadth is still there in that the underlying definition of a terrorist act, you know, encompasses effectively all sorts of threats as well as actions of all forms of political violence anywhere in the world. There's an underlying breadth, and there's no international consensus on what a terrorist act is, and of course the thorny question of the criminalisation of legitimate kind of freedom movements are captured under terrorist acts. So yes, there are less problematic laws, but the problem is that we still have it's not someone's individual conduct that is being criminalised in relation to listing, it's about your connection to an organisation. And this absolutely offends key principles of the rule of law. And so I didn't catch the other aspects of the question. Someone might have something else to add.
You pretty much answered my question. I'm looking for models that in the U.S. we can point to that provide evidence of successful ways of allowing peace building to go forward without securitizing it or inhibiting it all.
Yeah. I'm noticing that Kay's picture is frozen.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask.
We will.
I'm gonna ask Lisa and Tomicah to hide their webcams temporarily.
Okay.
Because it's slowing down the connection.
Okay. If we can.
Okay. Let's now try your question again.
Okay. Finalize my question. Hopefully that connection is stronger now. You pretty much answered my question. I'm looking for examples that we in the U.S. can point to as evidence to our allies within the U.S. government that can be used to show that there are better ways of addressing counterterrorism and not restricting peace building in the way that it is currently restricted. I think so. I think you pretty much answered that question. I'm going to look and see if there's one. We have time for one more before we close, and I think that it has to do with the question of unintended consequences that you raise in your report. And globally, do you find that restrictions on peace building are in fact intentional, as opposed to being unintended consequences of vague and broad language?
Yes, absolutely. They're completely intended and envisaged by the framework of counterterrorism law itself, which seeks to prohibit and penalise specified associations with listed actors. And the sorts of associations that are included as prohibited are ones that are very common peace-building practices. So in that sense, the answer is definitely yes. What we have seen is that the text of the law is very clear. The activities of peace-building practices such as providing bus tickets for people to attend peace talks, providing training in some jurisdictions is prohibited, and so on. These are all activities that are prohibited under the counter-terrorism laws. But in another sense, we haven't seen prosecutions of at least the large international NGOs. So while peace-building practices are firmly within the target and design of counter-terrorism laws, it's not translating into prosecutions. What the major finding of our report is that counter-terrorism listing targets peace building through disrupting peace builders' practices.
Can I add to that what struck me about your report, this is Lisa, is the impact on local civil society, that the international NGOs do have more protection and they are dissociating themselves from local civil society. So this is a major thing, because most of the foreign assistance reports are all coming out with local ownership. Local leadership is the first and primary principle. And if peacebuilding is switching away from local ownership or engagement with local civil society, that is a major different trend, and we need to discuss that.
Okay.
And I guess that's a really good example of the divergences that you demonstrate, Lisa, between the methodology and the analysis between counterterrorism and conflict transformation, and that's a really good example of the absolute conflict between the two.
I'd now like to move to close and ask the presenters, are any last comments you'd like to make before we log off? And thank you very much for participating in the webinar, and thank the participants for your patience with the webinar tool. We'll get better at it as we go.
I just wanted to thank everyone for their time in engaging with the report. We've absolutely just enjoyed and taken so much value from your expertise, and learnt so much from this seminar. And I'm sorry that we couldn't hear all of the translated questions, but please do feel free to drop Louise or I a line, via email if you want to continue the dialogue in some way. Thanks.
Yes, also thanks. It was an excellent conversation. I hope there's more opportunity to discuss these themes.
And a big amen from me as well. Great work, everyone, and a pleasure to be a part of the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. The report is long, but it's a reference you can take down off the shelf anytime you're working on these issues and find very helpful background and analysis, even if you don't take it to the beach and read it from cover to cover. So again, thank you to all, and we will stay in touch.